Hello, everyone, and welcome back we're back from our summer hiatus.
Yay.
Yay!
Yay!
It was a great summer for us in my household. I don't know about you guys. If you did anything fun or got to go anywhere. But one thing that we definitely got to do, or at least I did, was have some time to read. And as you know, we had a bit of a challenge that Kofi left us with at the beginning of the summer that Laura and I gladly accepted. And so we'll talk about the status of that. But first of all, and folks, we are coming at you in audio and in video this year. So you'll be able to gaze upon our countenances as we talk about books and other ish.
Yes,
So
another ish.
other ish. So how was your summer, guys? What'd you guys do? How'd it go?
It was my summer was good. I did a lot of reading and writing and writing and reading. I didn't really go too many places because this Delta virus thing started happening. So we thought we were gonna go on vacation, but no, the highlight was getting my daughter vaccinated and my son vaccinated. So that was my summer. Laura.
Well, we did take a couple of trips with like close family, and we went to the beach for a week, and we went to Deep Creek. So we went to the mountain and the lake. So that was really nice. We spent a lot of time just in the house cooking and eating and watching TV, and and also outside, just going to the beach and the water. So that was really nice to be able to get away. Yeah. And somewhere in there I did some reading.
So as a reminder, what was so as the reminder, the challenge for the summer was for each of us to read a book outside of our usual tastes and perhaps comfort zones. And so Kofi, you read Jodi Picoult, right?
Yeah, Mercy. Yeah. Yeah, I got like 50, 55 pages in, and I started having these epiphanies that maybe, just maybe, this isn't for me as a reader. And I think that's healthy. I think that sometimes, our tendency, especially if we've come out of literature programs or just academics in general, that we must finish and must like all books. I don't dislike the book. I just found that as I was reading it, the storyline, the ideals behind it were not as captivating for me. They just didn't hold me. It's about love, of course, but it's also about the limits that love can have in terms of assistant killing, or if you will, one of the characters kills his wife out of love or mercy because she was dying, and now he's back home in his hometown, or he's a relative of the sheriff of this town, and now they're sort of figuring out what to do. That this guy brings himself and his dead wife to their town. It's interesting, but it just didn't hold me as much as other books were holding me. And so I decided to let Jodi go. But I do like her phrasing. I do like her sentences. I do like her writing, but it just, as a story, it just didn't hold me.
So Kofi, I'm curious, what do you think did it what about it failed to hold your attention, maybe?
Well, I think it just didn't feel like a story I could relate to on a one level. But I also like stories and that have bigger themes, bigger ideas, things that are not so individualized, but a little more universalized in a way. And that it affects more than just one small community, but it affects a larger dynamic of communities. So I think, I don't know where Mercy falls within the Cole's writing history. But it felt a little more melodramatic than I would have liked. And I just read a book that was kind of melodramatic, and I didn't really expect to read another one. So I got through one, and I didn't want to go through another one. So I got maybe about a third of the way in or quarter of the way in, and I just tapped out. So my own challenge, I did not succeed.
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on your definition of success. You tried it, you gave it a shot, and I think it's healthy for us to, like you said before, maybe sometimes you just don't get through a book, and for whatever reason, and I think that's okay. How about you, Laura? How did yours?
It was definitely a summer of fails in terms of reading. I think I had mentioned in our last episode about summer readings, 3 different books, and I have failed to finish all 3 of them. So the big one was the Stephanie Meyer book called The Host. And I have to say, I actually do enjoy that kind of premise, sort of post-apocalyptic, situation, or, and I like that kind of plot, and but it was the writing for me. It could not hold my attention. And I think it's a long book, but I got in maybe 50 pages, which didn't take me too far, right? Because it's a long book. And what I found was it then interfered with my ability to read, period, because I kept trying to read this book, and I didn't want to abandon it, but I couldn't read it. So I would take it to the pool. Like every day, I'd read a paragraph and then put it away and just watch my kids play in the pool. So it became like a barrier to reading because I was trying so hard to try to read this book that didn't, as Kofi said, hold my attention. So I couldn't do it. And then the other 2 books I think was They Both Die at the End. Also very interesting premise. I'm not exactly sure what happened. It just lost interest. I thought it was a good plot and the characters were interesting.
Maybe it's the title gave away the ending.
Yeah, maybe too. Yeah, I'm like, I already know what happens. And then the 3rd book was I was going to read the 2nd book of the trilogy by Steph Cha, which is supposed to be like a thriller mystery. And I realized that in reading the 2nd book, which I did not finish, is that I must have given that first book a lot of benefit of doubt, or that being her first thriller mystery, as a writer, because I read her other novel, which was fantastic, called Your House Will Pay. And this was a different genre. And so maybe I was much more forgiving with that first book. And then it's sort of like in the 2nd book, it just wasn't enough for me to keep going with the 2nd book. So I failed. But I do want to talk about later, though, and I would love to hear also from Sylvia, too, about the Seeley Challenge in August, because I did end up reading a few books of poetry.
Yeah. So let's make it a 3 for 3. I failed as well. It's just a podcast of failure here. So I failed for a different reason, though. So I don't know what the fail is, where to pinpoint the fail, but I started reading. So my book that I was supposed to read was Crazy Rich Asians, to give that sort of like popular fiction, a try. I got maybe a couple pages in. I was like, why does it seem so familiar? Is it because I watched the movie, or what? And then I realized I read this before. A couple years ago on an airplane, because I had forgotten my actual book. And so I just kind of grabbed whatever was there. And I was like, oh, Crazy Rich Asians. Okay. So I think where I went, I think it was California. I think I left the book there. It's like, it's just out of my mind. And I didn't feel compelled to read it again. So partly because the prose, it was not that compelling, I guess. The sentences and the language just wasn't that compelling. And also I think reading the first part, like the second time around, I just was struck with, like, I think I was reaching unnecessarily. Like as a reader, I was
Mhm.
reaching more than I normally would to try and find meaning, like deeper meaning, but I just couldn't
Mm,
find that meaning because I felt like a lot of the characters, even though they have like real, well, they have struggles and issues with love and life and everything and being in this circle and the pressures of it. I don't know. It was just kind of rapid. And I think
Mm.
where I am now, like post, maybe it's the pandemic, maybe whatever, just looking at things differently with a different lens. I think it just felt very shallow and like, like there are real problems out there. This is not one of them. So I stopped reading it.
Yeah, I do. I did. I'm glad you mentioned in terms of, the conditions we find ourselves in now. I wonder if, maybe if I read a more recent Jodi Picoult book that might spark something more. And maybe I
ah,
was, the time period, because there was a time period in this country where euthanasia and assisted suicides was an issue, was a topic, and it felt like this book was speaking to that particular time. But it's also speaking to a particular culture that I'm just not a part of. And it's
mm,
just and that's weird because I've read books by other cultures that I'm not a part of, but I could see some level of connection.
Hmm.
With this, I felt like, maybe it just didn't grab me. It felt like it was talking about a community that was so far removed from anything I was interested in that I just couldn't grasp hold of it. And again, some of the scenes and some of the writing is really, really good. I mean, this is no shot or shade on her writing. It's just maybe I picked one of the books that
hmm.
just didn't
Right.
really do it for me.
Yeah.
She's written like a billion, so I'm sure that one of them is going to be
Hmm.
good. So or
Well,
maybe.
I do think that we are beings that exist in our time, right? And so, like, what is that? We teach it sometimes too, the idea of kairos, right? And the timing
Yeah,
of things. And so I think that does shift and change as a reader. That's why you look back at some books and you're like, whoa, that did not age well,
right.
or
Yeah, no, that's true.
yeah, or some books that have, like stayed constant throughout history, as something we come back to over again. It still feels very real. It still feels very relevant, for one reason or another. So I definitely think that there is something to that. But yeah, okay, so we failed.
But we learn through our failure, and I think that's the big part.
I
You
think,
know,
I think
and I
so.
and I and I guess promoting the idea that it's okay if you don't finish a book. Maybe that's not the book for you, and that's okay. It's like, as a colleague of ours, Renee said, sometimes it's like wine. You get a sip of wine, you go, I want to keep drinking this. And then you get a sip and you go, I don't want this. That's sometimes how a book can go.
Right. And better to put it down than suffer for a really bad headache, for
Yes,
example,
exactly. Exactly.
or
I
other
agree.
things. Yeah,
I agree.
I think that's
But actually, but this was probably a rare occasion where I didn't finish so many books. I usually try to power through, even if it's to by skipping a little bit, right? I just need to be able to say that I finished it. But I realized that again, like that idea of like this, my commitment to finishing this book that I wasn't enjoying was holding me back in terms of other readings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. Is there, so what are some of the other books that you did end up gravitating towards? Kofi, you said you were reading something else that was captivating you more. So what was that?
Yeah. Marlon James's Red Wolf, Red Leopard, Black Wolf. I'm sorry. It's colors. I'm not good at that. Um, and but it's sort of like this hero's journey, if you will, and it's set in it's set in Africa, probably West Africa, but it's mythologizing parts of it. It's fantastical in other parts of it. It's just really interesting, and it was sort of aligning with a project that I was working on, and so it felt right to read that.
Right.
And it, there was the other black girl, and I felt that felt right. And Keith Layman's, I have his book right here, Long Division. I started getting into
Oh.
that, and I like the structure of it. And I think one of the things that I'm sort of falling in love with is this play of form and things not being so linear. I like the stories that kind of vacillate within time
Mm.
and cause you to really be in the moment and wonder where they are in a positive way, not in a like, did this writer lose focus way? But you're going through these just journey with the characters, and you're learning about them, you're feeling what they're feeling. And again, it's no shade to Jodi Picoult, she's terrific. It's just with that book I didn't feel the same way. And so and Marlon James's book is almost 600 pages, and I was very much interested in reading that more so. What about you, Laura?
Was waiting to see if you remember my name.
Well, I was about to say Sylvia, but Sylvia asked me the question, so I didn't want to go back. It's like we're playing tennis, and I didn't
And
want to
then
do
I would have
that.
felt left out.
Yeah.
No,
Exactly.
actually, I did read, and I had to read, and I did enjoy very much Bell Hooks books. And Sylvia, Kofi, and I, the three of us, are in this faculty learning community this year on Bell Hooks at HCC. And in kind of preparation for that, I read her book on class. It's called Class Matters. And the other book is her memoir called Ain't I a Woman?
Mhm.
And I have to say, I mean, Ain't I a Woman is a classic, right? Especially if you're thinking of any sort of feminist thinking or theory in any field. That's a book that most people would have read or have, heard references to. But I think Class Matters is probably a little less, I don't know, like highlighted, and it was fantastic. She just presented the intersection of class, race, and gender, especially in the context of education, in such a clear way for me that I have not heard other people put it that way. So, and again, in her, style of writing, it is very personal. She talks about her own background. So that was a really good book for me to like dive into this summer. So I did that. I read those two books, which were great. And then I read some poetry in August. Sylvia last year introduced me to the Seeley Challenge, where you read one book of poetry a day in the month of August. And I think who's the poet? Is it Nicole Seeley?
Nicole Seeley, yeah.
Yeah, who started this. So yes, I failed in that I didn't read 30 books in August of poetry, but it did get me to read like cover to cover several poets whose books I have, and I didn't fully read like cover to cover. So I focused on some of our local poets I've have heard in person or I've met personally. So people like Alan King, Joseph Ross, Stephen Leva, Derek Weston Brown, Ethelbert Miller, and Laura Chauvin. So some of these folks that I have met and just really love their poetry, I really got to like dive deeper into their poetry. So I like that the Seeley Challenge. And even if you don't like complete it, it definitely gets you to read, right? Some at
Well,
least.
that's actually that's the true purpose of the Seeley Challenge. It's not so much to read a book a day, although that was like that was her like original challenge that she issued. But I think she wrote at the end, like whether you read one book or 30 books or 31 books, the whole purpose is to not just to spend that time to read poetry, but also make. I think the beauty of the Seeley Challenge is the community that it creates. So like people are sharing out, like you just did, the poets and the poetry that they're reading, and that makes poetry more visible in the world, which I think it doesn't really get that kind of like traction,
Mhm.
compared to like fiction or even nonfiction. So yeah, no, that was great. I didn't even try this year for the 31 books. I knew that it was going to be a tough month. So I think I committed to like 2 books a week or 2 to 3 books a week. And I ended up reading like maybe 1 book a week.
Mhm.
But it was still very meaningful, and each year like that I've been doing it, well, 2 years, there's been like an unofficial theme that has emerged, so like whether you're intentionally reading like local poets or poets of color or you know LGBTQ community it's a different theme that emerges for me every year, and I kind of like leave it up to poetic fate to decide for me like what it's gonna be. And this year I felt like the the emerging themes were about like genealogy, interestingly, and identity. So um, and then also like interestingly, like it's with a thread of like capitalism like in there. So like I read some poets and poetry that kind of linked the idea of like relational like dynamics to private property. Taylor Johnson, for
Mm.
example, who is I believe a transgender poet, like talks about this idea of like there's this one poem that really stuck with me about like um, the like any American, I have an addiction to private property, and it's like this. It's a weird way to
Mm.
think about like who you belong to and who belongs to you, and that we phrase our relationships that way a lot of times. He's mine, and,
Mhm. Mhm.
and it's always a good thing, right? Like it's usually a good thing, but this idea of like, yeah, like,
Right, because we do talk about like community in the sense of belonging, and we use that in a very positive way. Yeah,
yeah,
but
and
you're
I
right.
don't
That's
think,
very interesting.
yeah, and I don't think I don't think they were meaning to. Maybe I was reading too much into it, but that's nonetheless what I walked away with, and it was
Mm.
really interesting. Even my art, the art that we produce and we create, what do we create it for? And a lot of times we are sucked into this like capitalist, whatever, like machinery of
Right.
that. And so at what point is my art mine, and is it my property? Who does that belong to? I don't know. It's
Mhm.
just, it raised a lot of deeper, larger questions for me.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that I like about literature with the big L.
Mhm.
Um, is that it asks bigger questions that are not just individual in application or impact. And I think that sometimes, commercial fiction really is trying to get to a specific audience to feel a specific emotion or even think about a specific idea.
Right.
Whereas, what you were just describing, Sylvia, seems like it can go and branch off in various directions. And it then calls to question other things, and I think that that's what I think why certain melodramatic books for me don't work for me. But at the same time, which is kind of weird, sci-fi and thrillers and mysteries kind of do, and they are very much formulaic, but there's something about their formula and there's something about how they're telling that story. Robert Parker, I mean, Spencer for Hire is doing the same exact thing in every book, but there's something about that dynamic, or Sue Crofton, I think her name was, with the alphabets.
Mhm.
There's something unique about that for whatever reason I just can't put down. But with melodramatic books, it's like, oh no, not another happy ending. Like,
I mean,
Yes.
it probably has something to do with like the function of a particular genre in your life. Like you
yeah,
read certain kind of a book
Mm.
to serve a certain purpose. And then also the expectation you go into um, a book or a genre knowing or expecting it to do X, Y, and Z. And sometimes that's why you
absolutely.
go into it, because you know it's
Yeah.
going to do X, Y, and Z. And there's kind of a comfort in going back to that genre. And I think that's why like fans of mysteries, for example, are fans of mysteries. Um, Yeah, and maybe that's what sort of happened with Steph Cha's books. Like I don't regularly read mysteries or thrillers, so maybe it was a genre issue. Yeah, for me. Yeah.
Yeah.
So speaking of mysteries and thrillers, we've got some authors lined up for this season, and in what month are we in?
We're in September now.
It's officially fall, right? And so we wanted to share with our our listeners or viewers, our next book pick for October. It's called An Unkindness of Ghosts by Rivers Solomon. And it is a speculative fiction, right? Or slash sci-fi, right? So I think the comparisons, I've never read anything by this author before, but I think the comparisons are to like Octavia Butler and some of these other kind of Colson Whitehead, I think it was that was the description on the back cover. Two authors who I enjoy extremely. And so just in time for our spooky month of Halloween.
The setting of the novel, it takes place in a space vessel. And there are these like different decks on the spaceship where different types of people have to live. And one of I started reading it just a few pages last night. I couldn't help it. One of the really interesting things that you can look forward to, readers, is the writer, they are really showing us how to use the pronoun they. It's prominent in the novel, and this whole discussion about like, oh, it's too hard to say they, and people who insist on the she and he, and I think they do it really beautifully, at least in the first few pages that I read. And it's so interesting to see that pronoun they being used for a character in a very prominent way. And it was a treat for me to come across that when I opened the pages. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm actually really excited about that.
Yeah.
Which I read about, and I read some of the reviews
Yeah.
earlier. But the idea that like, especially in sci-fi, I mean, this is not the first. It's not unusual to find sci-fi works where there are no genders.
Mhm. Right.
Ursula K. Le Guin. I can't remember the name off the top of my head of the book. I think it's a series of books. And you're introduced to like a planet full of like genderless beings.
That's right. Yeah.
And so I'm really excited to that, and that's why I kind of, speaking of like form of genres, like that's why I really like sci-fi and speculative and other types of fiction, because it bends I can suspend my like anything rules. And you kind of are invited to do that. And I think there's so much freedom in that too, like being able to read in that way. So I'm excited.
Yep.
And
I am too.
Yeah, and I hope our listeners and our readers will pick up the book and read along with us, because that will be our next topic of conversation. We'd love to hear from you.
Indeed.
Anything else for the good of the order for us?
No, I'm really looking forward to the discussion. The book sounds so interesting.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to a whole year of recording with you guys.
Yes. You guys get to see me, and I get to read maybe some of your writing about seeing us. I don't know. or maybe your disagreement with Jodi Picoult. And like, Mercy was a great book. You need to reread it.
That would be great too.
That would be.
Welcome all comments. All right, everyone. Well,
thank you, everybody,
for tuning in, and we'll see you next month. And
see you next month.
Yep.
Bye-bye. Happy reading.
Happy reading.
Happy reading.